Hello, everyone. I should be live. You should be able to see this. Want to make sure we are good to go. As you can see, still have not had a haircut. Maybe one day. I'm going to wait a couple seconds till people arrive. They are probably not used to me starting on time because I've been late the last couple of days, weeks. I guess. The last couple of episodes, we'll call them, of Educating for Change. So, you see two people here. Hello and welcome. I'm going to wait a few more seconds. Yeah, I'll wait one more minute. Hey, Jay, how you doing? And I'm going to wait only a minute because these get recorded anyway, so it's not like class. And of course, you all know, those of you who have been here before, what the first couple of minutes of this always is anyway. Yeah, this is this. Ugh, vanity. So, I'll wait a few more seconds and then we'll start the standard boilerplate of each of these. So, I hope you all are enjoying what looks like a beautiful sunny day today in the Delaware Valley. I don't know how hot or cold it's going to be, but I'll see if I can get outside and get some fresh air, and I hope you all do too. So, all right, a few more seconds, and then I will get going. I figure waiting until 2 minutes into it seems fair, right? So they get about 10 seconds else to log in. And then we'll see where we are. So let me get started. I'll do my standard kind of introduction. And so what I say, as I say every week, and it bears repeating, particularly in this fact-challenged world, is that I am going to tell you about myself and my education and my background, because even though the source of an argument should not determine the validity or strength of that argument, it is definitely worth knowing the source of facts and information. And of course, for the purposes of these videos, I am the source of information. So my name's Joseph Solar, and I am an adjunct professor of African American history and U.S. history, which is the same thing, at Rowan College of Burlington County. That's where I met my partner and collaborator on this project, Lauren Purnell, who was, of course, my student. And I attained my PhD and my master's degree in urban education from Temple University. That is what brought me to the region. Actually, sorry, I was brought to the region for nonprofit work, and then I stayed for the PhD. I also attained my bachelor's degree in history and African American studies, so more than just history, so African American literature and sociology and whatever, from Harvard University. At Harvard, I was very, very lucky to study with some truly incredible people. You've probably seen Henry Louis, well, hopefully you have seen Henry Louis Gates Jr. on TV. He was one of my professors, as well as Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who's a fantastic historian, and James Loran Mattori, Randy Mattori, and who else did I study with? Werner Solors. I studied with just incredible people, and they helped me to learn so much, and it's my blessing to be able to share what I learned with you. So always remember that sources matter, especially in these highly charged times. We once again had another police shooting of a black man, and it is a grave tragedy that these shootings continue to happen in this country, and that the people who are supposed to protect all citizens are scared, mostly because of racism, I would argue, and that's an argument, but nonetheless, their fears and their prejudices cause them to harm the people they are meant to protect. And such things should not happen. And my hope is that as we go forward and we understand each other and our history, we will one day be able to move past the fears and hatreds and prejudices that cause people who are supposed to protect us to pull their trigger. So, anyway, I am talking about colonization. And I referred to this last week when I was discussing the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793 and the influence that the dedicated commitment of the black community in Philadelphia to contain and fight that epidemic, as well as to care for the sick and bury the dying, had. And so I know that we think of colonization as what brought Europeans to the Americas. And if you saw my earlier video, it also is what brought Africans to the Americas. San Augustine, Florida, that first United States city settled by European and African settlers, both enslaved and free. So, what do I mean by colonization? Colonization, if you say it with a capital C, in the United States, generally refers to the potential movement of Africans and African Americans back to Africa. And we have seen this idea manifest many times over the centuries. And I will argue, and note, there's a difference between my facts and my argument. I will argue that colonization, when the idea of colonization manifests within the black community of the United States, is at times when leaders in that community are feeling the least hopeful about the future of the United States. And so we know of generally the major colonization movement led by Marcus Garvey and his United Negro Improvement Association, which was extant in the 1920s, which was the time when America was passing eugenics laws and was providing the intellectual inspiration for the Nazis. So if there was a time that was hopeless, that was definitely a time. But I'm going to go all the way back. I mentioned Garvey, but I'm not going to talk about Garvey. Maybe a future episode. I'm going to go all the way back to the beginnings of these ideas. And so when we consider African enslavement in the New World, in the Americas, we must consider, of course, that Africans were kidnapped. They were captured, kidnapped, shackled, chained, abused. And so we know from records kept by slave ship captains that the captive Africans would often attempt to jump overboard, either as suicide or, in some cases, jump overboard with the hope of swimming back home to Africa. And in fact, in a lot of African spirituality and later African American spirituality, people would speak of the dead as going home, of their souls taking flight, their souls taking wing and flying back home to Africa. And so there was always this sensibility of wanting to go home. It's worth noting that as much as we have this story of the Americas and immigration to the Americas, that large numbers of people who immigrated to the Americas voluntarily went home afterwards. They didn't stay. And so those are the people who came voluntarily. A lot of the Europeans who came to the Americas were desperate to leave horrifying circumstances at home, poverty, misery, disease, the sick streets of London, joblessness. This is not the circumstances for Africans. Africans were kidnapped. That's not to say they didn't, some might not have had miserable lives at home, but the reality is they came by and large involuntarily. And so the idea of going back home to the home from which they were taken was a very powerful, powerful idea and motivation. And some did make it home. But in terms of a movement or an organized kind of enterprise of colonization, in the United States, colonial era was always tricky and confusing. But in the United States, we actually see in the American Revolution the first organized plan for colonization. And I'm about to drop the mind blow on you. It's from Thomas Jefferson. So in 1778, Jefferson publishes his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia. And I have mentioned before, and any of my students would tell you that I always say Thomas Jefferson embodies America perfectly, in that he is brilliant and hypocritical. He is powerful and weak. He is spendthrifty. He is racist, but with black children. And so it might be surprising to hear that Thomas Jefferson first articulates a plan of colonization. And it's in Query 14 of his Notes on the State of Virginia that he first articulates his plan. And it is connected to a proposed law in Virginia in 1778, so 3 years into the American Revolution, at a time when Africans and African Americans were running away from plantations and joining the British Army to fight against the American Revolution because the British had promised freedom. And in fact, the first anti-slavery law cases in the English-speaking world had already been brought and won by afterwards formerly enslaved people in England. And so for enslaved people, this was the chance for freedom. And the British were no better or no worse than the Patriots. After all, the Patriots spoke liberty, but cracked the whip over their backs. And so what did they have to lose? And so at that time, the Virginians actually proposed emancipating enslaved people. And Jefferson says this. I have to read it to you because it blows my mind. Jefferson comments on a bill to emancipate all slaves born after passing the act. So it would be what we call gradual emancipation. And this was the emancipation program that Pennsylvania had. So people who were enslaved remained enslaved, but their children were born free. And note, this is important because, of course, it was Virginia that first passed the law that made people slaves at birth. And so this law proposed to return to them what was, according to the Declaration of Independence, their inalienable right to liberty at birth. But anyway, that hypocrisy aside, it says this, an amendment, that children born after the emancipation should continue with their parents to a certain age, then be brought up at the public expense, public schools, to tillage, farming, arts or sciences, according to their geniuses, till the females should be 18 and the males 21. So Jefferson proposes that children born to enslaved people who are now free should stay with their parents as babies until they are old enough to go to school which will be paid for by the state of Virginia. Then, after they've been brought up to the age of 18 and 21, they should be colonized. He uses the word colonized to such a place as circumstances of the time should render most proper, sending them out with arms, implements of household and of the handicraft arts, feeds, pairs of domestic animals, etc., and declare them a free and independent people, and extend to them our alliance and protection, till they shall have acquired strength. Jefferson is proposing that slavery should be ended gradually, and that enslaved children should be brought up in public schools, which, just to give you some perspective, don't exist outside Massachusetts and Connecticut at this time. And even then, those were just exclusively religious schools. But generally speaking, there's no such thing as public schools, and Thomas Jefferson is proposing them for the children of enslaved people. And then the enslaved people will be colonized to another country, but not just dumped off willy-nilly, with education, tools, animals, everything they would need to create their own society. And Jefferson declares it a free and independent society that would be in alliance with the United States. This is perhaps utterly shocking to think about, that the United States, or that a prominent leader, member of the Continental Congress, literally proposed a gradual emancipation scheme that would result in the creation of a colony somewhere throughout the world. It did not go anywhere, this proposal, as you could have assumed, because the Virginians of the time, the slave-owning Virginians, were more concerned about slavery than about liberty. But nonetheless, the idea had been floated, the idea was out there, and it encapsulated some of Jefferson's notions about education and public education for people as being essential. Jefferson's idea ultimately was to create a white republic. So he is, in that sense, the father of white nationalism. But he also accepted and believed in a black republic. And when asked why they should be a separate republic, he said this: deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, real distinctions, will divide us into parties and produce convulsions. So Jefferson believed that slavery should end gradually, and that the white and black races should go their separate ways because they would be unable to coexist because of white prejudice and black grievance for having been oppressed. So, as much of an idealist as he was also very cynical about human nature. So again, like I said, an idealistic man who's also a cynic. He is the embodiment of America, the yin and the yang, the up and the down, all of that. So that idea goes away. Never fully goes away. So I'm going to introduce a new player in our story. And his name is Paul Cuffey. And just in case you're wondering, I will, of course, provide links to all this information so that you can read it and check up on it yourself. Paul Cuffey embodies what we today call the American dream. Paul Cuffey was one of 10 children from southeastern Massachusetts. He lived on one of the barrier islands off the Cape called Cuttyunk. His father was Coffey Slocum, a man who had been kidnapped and brought into Massachusetts as an enslaved man who won his freedom. The name Coffey means that he was born on Friday. So Coffey earns his freedom and he marries a Wampanoag woman. Now, understand that the southeastern Massachusetts along the Cape, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, the islands, this was the kind of unsettled country. And so Cuffey, Slocum, was settled in an area where the survivors of the Wampanoag native peoples lived, Pequots, other native people survived there, and of course, other Africans settled there. So Paul Cuffey, who was originally Paul Slocum, is this melding of African and Native American worlds, and he's fully American. As he grows up, he helps out on his father's farm in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, because his father owned land, the idea and the importance of heritable generational wealth. And eventually, by the time he attained his adulthood in the 1780s, he had become a whaler, serving on whaling ships, which was one of those integrated careers because, of course, when 20 sailors are on a longboat trying to spear an 80-ton sperm whale, they don't have time to worry about whether the person on the boat with them is white or black. And in fact, the harpoon was invented by an African whaler, or African American whaler. I have not been able to find the man's name yet. And so, while serving on these whaling expeditions, he himself was able to put away money, and eventually, through the early years of the American Republic, the brand new American Republic, Paul Cuffey becomes a successful merchant, and he owns several ships, and he is trading along the Atlantic seaboard. So while Paul Slocum, who renamed himself Paul Cuffey in honor of his father, while Paul Cuffey is attaining his freedom, abolitionists in England are trying to figure out how they could best abolish slavery in England. And an organization was created by the several Brits called I lost the name. Shoot, I don't have the name of it. Sorry, I thought I had it. But the men who were engaged in the Sierra Leone Company, Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce, and Granville Sharp, the Lord Mansfield. So William Wilberforce was a leading Methodist minister. And remember, the Methodists were, of course, Richard Allen's denomination. So these men decided that maybe Thomas Jefferson's plan could work. And so they sent an expedition to the coast of Africa, and they negotiated. And by negotiated, according to some accounts, the sailor, the African-British sailor that they sent to scout, held a gun to the head of the local chief and demanded that he sell land to the expedition. And they created the Province of Freedom on the coast of Africa in 1787. So after the American Revolution. This Province of Freedom will later become the city of Freetown in Sierra Leone. And the British idea was, or these philanthropists' idea was, we'll build a colony in Africa, and so that Africans freed from slavery can settle there. Sierra Leone would later be a major staging area for the British Navy when they were suppressing the transatlantic slave trade after they unilaterally outlawed it in 1807. So they create this colony in 1787, and interestingly enough, a few years later, the first major block of settlers were African Americans who had fought for the British in the war, been settled in Canada, found Canada an unwelcoming place, both by climate and by people, and so they had petitioned to be moved to Sierra Leone, to Freetown. The leader, or one of the leaders, there's actually a couple, but one of the leaders of that movement from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone was a guy named Harry Washington. That Washington. He was George Washington's enslaved groomsman, and he ran away and became a leader in Freetown, Sierra Leone. So we have the British creating this colony in Sierra Leone in the late 1780s. They are settling African-American loyalists from after the Revolution in Sierra Leone by the 1790. Paul Cuffey's making money and building his fortune. So while this is also happening, Thomas Jefferson, I swear these players are all intertwined, gives out a patent for the cotton gin. And here's the thing to understand. Slavery was going away in the United States. Many slave keepers, as they were called in that time period, were actually freeing enslaved people. Pennsylvania had come up with the first abolition law, then Massachusetts, then Connecticut, Rhode Island. Vermont actually joins the United States in 1787-ish, and they never had slavery legalized. By 1800, New York had abolished slavery. By 1804, New Jersey had abolished slavery. Ohio comes into the United States in 1804, also without legal slavery. So slavery is going away. But then cotton. Cotton turns everything around. And so throughout the 1790s, the status of slavery is still very much in contention. And this is another kind of footnote, if you will, to the yellow fever story and the black community kind of saving the government in the city and the capital of the United States, in that Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were very keen that they had the chance to influence the powers that were at the time in the United States by demonstrating the talents and the dedication of the black community to the United States in the hopes of motivating emancipation. But sadly, it would not be. After New Jersey outlawed slavery, no state would outlaw slavery until after the Civil War. Free states would come in, but none would outlaw slavery. While this is all happening, of course, the Haitian Revolution has been raging. And by 1803, the Republic of Haiti is formed. And there is a brand new republic led by revolutionaries who had themselves been enslaved people. So all of these ideas and factors and events or circumstances are whirling around. And by the early 1800s, Paul Coffey's fleet is large enough that he is able to conduct transatlantic voyages. And he's very interested to see what is happening in this Sierra Leone, in this free town. And he begins conducting trade missions from Massachusetts, from Rhode Island, to Sierra Leone. So he's crisscrossing the ocean, and he even offers to transport African Americans who want to move and settle in Sierra Leone. And so some people take him up on the offer, and he begins bringing settlers to Sierra Leone from the United States. Part of what is happening is, of course, as cotton is incentivizing a continuation of slavery, there is a growing tide of prejudice against African Americans. And the form that this prejudice takes, interestingly enough, is that African people are barbaric. They are barbarians. They are savages. In other words, it's very much the language that Europeans used when describing Native Americans, i.e. Paul Cuffey's mom. So Paul Cuffey, no doubt, hears the language that calls him a barbarian on both his mother's side and his father's side. And he begins to lose hope. He makes journeys to Philadelphia, and he strikes up a very profitable business relationship with James Forten, someone else who I might do an entire episode on or parts of. And of course, he becomes acquainted with Richard Allen, who was at that time building the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and who is very enthusiastic about spreading the Christian gospel far and wide, and from Allen's perspective, to bring the Christian gospel to Africa. Because despite the fact that they are subject to prejudice, people like Richard Allen are African Americans. They don't know Africa. They're not from Africa. So what they know of Africa is what they've been told. And so they seem to, not entirely, because obviously they recognize the motivated reasoning of people saying bad things about Africa, but what they do, quote, know is that large pieces of the African coast and the countries in Africa, or the tribes as they might have called them, were not Christian. And if they could bring Christianity to Africa, they could help civilize the continent and spread civilization and Christian virtue. So Allen becomes interested in this endeavor. Now, it doesn't go very far, because in the early 1800s, Cuffey's losing hope, but Allen is building institutions. Allen is building community. The African Methodist Episcopal Church is spreading. People are becoming free day by day by day in New England, in the mid-Atlantic states. And there is a growing free black community that's part of the United States. And one of the things that I mentioned last week that Allen said is that part of the dedication and sacrifice of the black community in 1793 was a notion that this was their country. And so they were going to fight and defend and protect and save their city, their country, their fellow country people. So it kind of goes back and forth. A turning point is reached in 1812. The War of 1812 breaks out between the United States and Britain again. The President of the United States at the time is James Madison. He is a wealthy, slave-owning Virginia planter and friend of Thomas Jefferson, the father of the Constitution, as we sometimes call him, though I'm not sure what he did that was more than Hamilton and John Adams and the rest, but whatever. And Paul Cuffey has one of his ships seized by U.S. Customs because the ship had returned from a trading mission with Sierra Leone, which meant that Paul Cuffey was trading with the enemy. So Cuffey, a wealthy, very wealthy, I don't even know how wealthy he was, because I'm sure people didn't want to talk about that, was also very confident. And so he didn't ask, he demanded a meeting at the White House with James Madison. And he received a meeting at the White House with James Madison. So think about this. During the War of 1812, this man Cuffey, son of an African freedman and a Wampanoag woman, was able to demand and receive a meeting with the President of the United States. That's how you know he was loaded. He had some cash. And at the end of the meeting, Madison ordered that Cuffey's ship should be released back to him, and all of his goods and property that had been seized released to him, because it was clearly a misunderstanding and Cuffey's a patriot, and etc. During the War of 1812, African Americans again ran away to the British for freedom. So this idea of, again, slavery on the agenda, it was again on the agenda. Cuffey is beginning to think that maybe it's time to leave. And what Cuffey suggests is that maybe if African Americans promised to leave the country completely, James Madison and the new rising generation of slave-owning politicians like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun would move forward with the abolition of slavery. That maybe all of that barbarian talk, all of that fear of black people was what kept them holding on to slavery as a means of holding these scary barbarians in chains. And so we don't know specifically what was discussed at that meeting between Madison and Cuffey. What I do know is that just a couple years later, after the War of 1812 ended, in 1816, a Presbyterian minister from Basking Ridge, New Jersey, named Robert Finley, worked to create the American Colonization Society. Inspired by Sierra Leone, the American Colonization Society was going to work to move the free black population back to Africa. And Finley demonstrated a more insidious motivation, which perhaps motivated Madison, Henry Clay, and other slave owners who somehow supported colonization. And basically, Finley believed that Africans could never be integrated into American society, right? So it's a version, but a little less charitable, if you will, than Jefferson's version. Jefferson said, we couldn't live together. Finley says, they can't live with us. But he thought that by going back to the land of their fathers, as he put it, back to Africa, African Americans could find progress, development, and civilization. And Finley, kind of like Richard Allen, believed they could spread the Christian gospel onto the African continent, that African Americans would make the ideal missionaries to Africa. And so they created this organization. Now, the thing about this American Colonization Society is it wins immediate support from among the slave-owning class. And that should be your first warning when they are super enthusiastic about this enterprise. And it's pretty simple. When people like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun and James Madison and James Monroe supported the American Colonization Society, they had no intention of abolishing slavery. Their only intention was to remove the black population, the free black population from the United States, which they believed, argued, hoped would help secure slavery. In fact, James Monroe was such an enthusiastic supporter of this colonization scheme that when the American Colonization Society purchased, wink wink, a block of land right next to Sierra Leone and called it Liberia, Liberty, they named the capital city after the president. And so thus we have Monrovia as the capital of Liberia. At the time that the American Colonization Society is formed, Coffey and Allen and others, Absalom Jones, are kind of enthusiastic, half and half. They're of mixed feelings. They want a colonization scheme and a missionary enterprise to Africa. They believe this is a great way to do it. And so they actually convene, I'm going to read to you again. They convene a meeting at the end of 1816 in Philadelphia at Mother Bethel Church to discuss whether people should support colonization. And Allen gives some speeches that are kind of like, yeah, this should be a good idea. We can bring Christianity. We can spread civilization. The people who attend this conference in Philly at 6th and Lombard overwhelmingly reject the colonization scheme, and they are very straightforward. I could summarize their words for you, but why when I can read you their words as to why? And keep in mind what I had said about the yellow fever. So, Philadelphia, January 1817, they have this meeting, and they say this: whereas our ancestors, not of choice, were the first successful cultivators of the wilds of America. We, their descendants, feel ourselves entitled to participate in the blessings of her luxuriant soil, which their blood and sweat manured, and that any measure or system of measures having a tendency to banish us would not only be cruel, but in direct violation of those principles which have been the boast of this republic. In other words, this is our country. We built this country. We tilled the soil. Sure, we were brought here as captives and enslaved, but nonetheless, we built this country. Mind you, this is only 1816. And so you cannot have us build the country and then banish us someplace else. They say even more. Resolved that we view with deep abhorrence the unmerited stigma attempted to be cast upon the reputation of the free people of color by the promoters of this measure. And they quote from the American Colonization Society that they are a dangerous and useless part of the community. So the people who built the country are dangerous and useless. Too bad they didn't feel that way when the slave trade ships were there. They might have just left them at home. When in the state of disenfranchisement in which they live, in the hours of dangers, they cease to remember their wrongs and rallied around the standard. They said, so even though people have stigmatized us and said these things about us, when there was danger, we stood up and we fought and we defended and we nursed, in the case of yellow fever. They further go on to say that they will never separate themselves voluntarily from the slave population in this country, and that our brethren, by the ties of consanguinity, blood, of suffering and of wrong, we feel there's more virtue in suffering privations with them than fancied advantages for a season. So there's the three-part thing. This is our country, we built it, and so thus we're entitled to the fruits of our labor. Secondly, we have always rallied to this country, and the people who are promoting this are prejudiced against us and thus can't be trusted. And third, we are not going to leave behind fellow Africans who are enslaved and in bondage. And it's that third point that, of course, underscores the real motivation of the Colonization Society, which was they recognized that African Americans saw the injustice of slavery. And as long as there was slavery and there were free people of color, the free people of color would work against slavery. And if they worked against slavery, then how were all these slave owners going to make money with cotton? And so the document says, we do not stand for this. We will not stand for this. And so even though there will be, of course, some African Americans who will be members of the Colonization Society, and even several hundreds and then eventually thousands over the years who will move to Liberia, by and large, the main leaders of the community completely denounce this scheme as just another insidious maneuver, which it was, to maintain and perpetuate a system of oppression and slavery against African American people. And of course, what is always notable is that although the goal was the maintenance of slavery, as they quoted in the document itself, it was cast in very prejudiced terms. It denounced the humanity and the spirit and the morality of African people by calling them useless and dangerous. And the reality is they were dangerous. They were dangerous to slave owners. And that was true. And in fact, they were far from useless. Had African people been useless, they would never have been enslaved. And so the reality is they twist logic and they twist reality to try to create yet another scheme to secure the institution of slavery for the future generations, so that wealthy, already wealthy, white people can become even richer without having to do any work them at all, simply steal the profits of the productive labor of enslaved Africans. And so colonization disappears for nearly 2 generations. to go back to the argument that I made. So again, this is my interpretation. This isn't necessarily a fact, that colonization always manifests when times are hopeless. It seems as if in the 18 teens, many African Americans didn't feel hopeless because they rejected colonization. From that point forward, the colonization society moves forward with an almost entirely white leadership and a white membership base and white supporters who a great many of them were slave owners. But colonization will pop up again in the 1850s. And why is that notable? Because in 1851 is when the Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it the federal government's responsibility to hunt down people who had run away from bondage. And so throughout that decade, as we see, to put it mildly, the screws put to black freedom, we see another colonization back to Africa movement spearheaded by a man named Martin Delaney from Pennsylvania, a free man who studied at Harvard Medical College until he had to drop out because of prejudice from his classmates, and who would travel to Liberia and try to resurrect this scheme of back to Africa because he believed there was not a lot of hope in the United States. And so we should leave, we should leave, we should leave. Africa's the true homeland. And Delaney's an interesting character because he spearheads the colonization movement in the 18, or he tries to bring it back. There's no real mass movement at the time. He tries to bring it back, but when the Civil War breaks out, Martin Delaney enlists and he becomes the first non-commissioned black officer in the U.S. military since at least the War of 1812, maybe even earlier, and will enthusiastically recruit tens of thousands of black soldiers to fight in the Union Army. And so that moment of hope and enthusiasm. And then after the Revolution, after the Civil War, when slavery is over and the Reconstruction, and he begins to see the violence against people that I discussed with Booker T. Washington, the Booker T. Washington episode, you see him bring back the colonization scheme again, only this time he was joined by others like Henry Highland Garnett and Alexander Crummell. And so this notion and this idea of back to Africa has never fully gone away. W.E.B. Du Bois moved to Ghana and lived his last years in Ghana when he died in the 1960s. But nonetheless, to me, my opinion on the facts is that when we see people begin to believe they need to leave the country, it's when they are running out of hope. And so I too choose to look at the document that came out of Mother Bethel in 1817, January 1817, which basically says, this is our country. We built it. We manured it, right? They fertilized and brought forth produce and profit and money and development. Black hands planed and built the roads of D.C. They built the buildings. They cleared the forests. They tilled the soil. And that means that African Americans have as powerful a claim on the United States of America as anyone. And it is worth noting, of course, that when we hear a lot of prejudice statements or things from people, that a great many of these people saying these things, their ancestors weren't even here in this country when African Americans were already building the institutions, the society, the culture, and the economy of the United States of America. And so colonization is when people believe that all of that work and all of that sacrifice will never be rewarded. And so pull up our stakes and go. And I, for one, am glad colonization never worked, because I live in a country that has been richly shaped by the contributions of African Americans, including defining freedom. Alrighty. I'll pause for questions. This went a little longer than I had hoped, but I'm still under an hour. So, if anyone has any questions for me, I will provide you links. There, the Library of Congress is a great website linking to primary sources about the American Colonization Society. I've got a couple of short curated biographies on Paul Cuffey, and I don't have a link to notes on the state of Virginia, but I will tell you it's readily accessible. I'll see if I can dig it up and throw it up there too, make it easier for you to find it and read it. But it was Thomas Jefferson's only book, and it has other horrifying bits to it as well. But his scheme, incidentally, was kinder and more generous than the Colonization Society's scheme, because he actually wanted to provide education and like a starter pack for a new country, whereas the colonizationists were like, here's a boat, good luck. All right. I'll wait a few more seconds for questions if anybody has any. As always, you're welcome to ask questions in the comments afterwards, and I can answer them after the fact. And I'm still not sure what I'll talk about next week, but as you can tell, the more you talk, the more you unpack more and more and more and more topics that are just, yes, exactly, Jay. And not only not appreciated, actively denied. I always say to my students in African American history that we have to know African American history because there is no American history without African American history. There is no America without African people. And even though our society and culture didn't quite manifest race relations the way the Spanish did in shaping their societies, nonetheless, I mean, America is America because Africans are Americans. There's no way around it. There's no denying it. Anyone who denies it is a fool or a liar. Jay, you're killing me. I'm getting ready to start my semester teaching my RCBC students online, so I'm gonna be even busier than I have been. But this is good though, Jay, because once a week means I got baby, 52 weeks a year. I can keep this going for 2-3 years. Any more questions? Or any questions out there? I always appreciate your comments. I'll give you 30 seconds. I'm looking at the comment scroll. I'm still going to be here. I'll be here next week. Don't worry. I'm still going to do it. Yeah, I'm teaching online because the school is being intelligent and not meeting in person and spreading disease. So I'll be here next week at noon for another whatever my mind can conjure up. All right, everybody. Have a beautiful day. I hope you get outside and enjoy some sunshine. We all need some fresh air and some uplift. Hopefully, part of the lesson you take away from this is the uplift. And the fact that there was a really, really rich guy named Paul Coffey who was able to say, I need to talk to the president. And the president had to talk to him, even though that president was a slave owner. All right. Goodbye, y'all. Have a beautiful day, and I will talk to you soon. Look for the links in a couple minutes. All righty? Take care. Bye.